Hi, I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. In today's video, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is sourdough starters. Specifically today, we're going to talk about how to create a new sourdough starter. Now, if you've been following my videos for a while, I have a very popular video from 2020 called How to Create a Sourdough Starter Step by Step. I strongly recommend watching that video if you're just getting into making a starter for the first time. But when I've watched that video recently, what I've seen is that I show what your starter should look like every day, day 1 through 9, what it should look like, what it should smell like. And over the years since I created that video, I've noticed that that video got off to a little bit stronger start. And what I'm showing the starter looking like on day 4, for example, might be more likely what you would see on day 7. So today, I'm going to augment that video with a new video that shows what your starter should look like on days 1 through 10, and I would call this a little bit more typical timeline. It's a little slower than what you'll see in that original video, and this will help you calibrate your expectations, and I'll add a couple more tips and tricks that aren't included in that video. In addition to this video, I've also created a new guide, the ultimate guide to creating a new sourdough starter. This is a fantastic piece of work. It's free and available on my website. If you're creating a new sourdough starter for the first time, I strongly recommend downloading and printing this document. This follows my original video exactly, and it includes some of the content that you'll see in this video. Now, I won't go through every step of the process here because that's detailed in my other original video. I suggest starting there, then come back here, and we'll go through this 10-day cycle in detail now. So in today's video, I'll be following this chart which shows the typical first 10-day cycle of creating a sourdough starter. It's broken up into 3 stages. Stage 1 is days 1, 2, and 3. That's when we activate the microbes. Essentially, we're rehydrating and waking up dormant yeast and lactic acid bacteria cells in the bags of flour. Around day 3, you'll see a burst of activity in your starter known as the false rise. I'll talk about that in more detail later. Then we go into stage 2, which is called the quiet period or the quiet days. This is where you'll see very little activity on your starter, usually just some bubbles on the surface as the yeast population is beginning its growth. Then we move into stage 3, which is days 7, 8, 9, and 10. This is the slow strengthening stage where your starter actually will start rising after you feed it. And typically, if you do everything right and you have a little luck, on day 10, you will have a starter that's strong enough to use for baking. Now you'll notice that yellow dotted line on the chart, which represents the yeast population. Most of the activity happens at the end of this process, so it really requires patience. So on day 1, you're going to feed your starter its initial feeding, and what I recommend is a 50-50 mix of bread flour and whole wheat flour. The reason you want to use these 2 flours is because you're trying to cultivate yeast and lactic acid bacteria in this jar, and the vast majority of those microbes are found in the whole wheat flour, not the bread flour. So a lot of recipes that are out there now say that you can create a sourdough starter using all-purpose flour or 100% bread flour. It just doesn't contain the same amount of microbes as the whole wheat flour. So absolutely start with at least 50% whole wheat. With that 50-50 mix of flour, you're going to take 75 grams of that and feed it with 75 grams of non-chlorinated water and put that in a jar. Now let's talk about what kind of jar you want to use. I recommend using a fairly small jar like this. This is a 1 pint or half-liter jar with a wide mouth and straight sides, because the most important thing you want to do with your starter is scrape down the sides after you mix it, because if your starter is going to get moldy, it'll typically happen where you did not scrape down the sides of the jar. So I keep my jar fairly clean after I mix it, and you want to have a solid lid like this, and I put the lid on, but I don't seal it airtight. I'll do it finger tight and then back it off a quarter turn so my lid fits loosely like this. And that loose lid will allow carbon dioxide to escape, and it will allow oxygen to enter. This is the perfect setup for creating a new sourdough starter. Now, some people nowadays are recommending, I see on social media, people using these giant starter jars with some type of fabric lid on them because they think your starter needs to breathe or something through this fabric. You don't want to do this. This is a horrible setup for a jar. Number one, because you should be using such a small amount of starter that you would have maybe a ½ inch in the bottom of this jar. Then you can't really tell if your starter is rising, but it also creates a huge surface area on top that will dry out because you don't have a real lid on here. And you know what likes a dry starter? Mold. This is basically a recipe for attracting mold. I've created this mold collection net on the top. If you use a paper towel or cheesecloth or a coffee filter, I see. So if there are mold spores flying around in your house, every 24 hours they're collecting on this net, and then the next morning I get ready to feed my starter, and as soon as I touch this, any mold spores that are in this fabric have now gone into my jar, and then when I lift this off, I agitate it again, more mold spores fall in my jar, and I've basically created a way to attract mold into my jar, and I've created a way to dry out the surface of my jar by using a porous lid, which is how you create mold in your starter. Don't do this. Day 2, 24 hours later, you open your starter jar, you take a look. It will still typically be pretty flat, and you might see a few surface bubbles. That's all you want to see on day 2. That means there's some life in your starter. Bubbles are life. When your yeast reactivates and it starts eating the sugars from the bread flour, it creates carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide creates bubbles, and the bubbles mean that your yeast is reactivating. You always want to smell your starter each day. On day 2, it should still smell pretty much like flour and water. Now, with my method, I do not recommend discarding or refeeding until day 4. So this is based on Chad Robertson's method from 2006. This is one of the most popular and reliable methods for creating a sourdough starter. My method is largely based on his with a few minor modifications. Now, people will say you have to discard and feed your starter every 24 hours. I do not agree with that, and I don't recommend that. So by letting this sit without discarding for 72 hours, you're basically giving this flour a very long runway to make sure that you're letting all those yeast cells, the dormant yeast cells that are dehydrated in here, you're trying to get as many of those reactivated as possible before you do the first discard. Once you start discarding, you're actually weakening your starter quite a bit. So the 72-hour time without discarding is important for this method to work. So on day 2, when you look at your starter, sometimes even with the lid on your starter, if your house has low humidity, you'll start to see your starter drying out a little bit on top. And when the whole wheat flour in that blend dries out, sometimes it'll turn a little bit darker color. That's perfectly normal. But if your starter looks like it's drying out, you want to stir it up at that 24-hour mark, because the thing that likes a dry starter is mold. You don't want to let mold get started in here. So stir it up at the 24-hour mark. You can never hurt your starter by stirring it. Day 3, this is typically where things go crazy. You wake up in the morning, you look at your starter, you're like, oh my God, what's happened here? This is called the false rise. Usually happens around day 2, 3, or 4, most commonly on day 3. And what happens is, in a bag of flour, there are all kinds of bacteria in here, in addition to the yeast and lactic acid bacteria that we want to cultivate. And these bacteria are all coming to life at the same time. So what you're seeing here is what's called a bacterial bloom, or a false rise. And it's all the nasty stuff that was in that bag of flour saying, hey, somebody fed us some water, let's have a party, and they all come back to life at the same time. Sometimes your starter will exceed the top of this jar and spill over, so put it on a plate or something like that. This is a one-time thing that happens, and this huge rise in the volume of the jar is not the yeast. Some people see this and they're like, whoa, wow, my starter's ready to go. I'm going to be baking bread tonight. Don't do that. What you're seeing here is bacteria, which can include things like E. coli and salmonella and some really nasty stuff. That bacteria will burn off in this false rise, Then we're going to start discarding and refeeding the next day, and that's where we start our path to building the yeast population. So just expect this, but when you see it, ignore it and just wait till the next day. However, at that 48-hour mark, you want to look at it again, and if it's drying out on top, stir it up, because the thing that loves a dry starter is mold. And as I said, every 24 hours when you inspect your starter, you also want to smell it. Man, on day 3, this can smell foul. I mean, this can smell like dirty socks, old cheese, vomit. I mean, you can really get some horrible smells in here. It's totally normal. The other thing that can happen in the early days of a new starter, and I'm not showing it in this example, but you can also see water separation. Water separation will be a thin layer of water on the top, the middle, or the bottom of your jar of starter. It'll just be a thin layer of liquid. You'll see it in there, clear liquid. That's basically what happens with a weak starter. The flour and water aren't fully commingled yet, and you'll see that thin layer of water separation. Now, one of the biggest mistakes people make is they go online, they type in the Google and they say, I'm seeing a thin layer of liquid on my starter, what is it? 90% of the responses that you'll get through Google, or if you ask people, is they'll say, that's hooch. Hooch is the alcohol that forms on a mature starter after it has risen and fallen and has completely consumed all the flour and it starts starving. So with a mature starter, when you see that thin layer of liquid on the top and it smells like alcohol, people will tell you your starter is starving, you need to discard and refeed. It's impossible for hooch to form in a new starter because we don't have enough yeast in here to actually eat all the flour yet. So anytime you see liquid forming on your starter, I'd say even in the first 10 days, assume that it's water separation and your starter is weak. It's not hooch. It's impossible for it to be hooch, which would mean your starter was so strong that it ate all the flour and now it's starving. It's impossible for this to be hooch. So many people make this mistake in the early days of their starter because they read online and say it's starving. The worst thing you can do right now, discard and refeed, because we're only on our 48-hour mark and we need to let this go 72 hours to get fully established. If you discard at the 48-hour mark, you're substantially setting yourself back in terms of the yeast production. So now on day 4, we're entering the next phase of the cycle. This is called the quiet period. Here's a chart where I show what you should typically expect for day 1 through day 10. And you can also download this chart. These are all in the description of this video. This is a one-page sheet that shows what to expect on day 1 through day 10. Now this is the point where people start to freak out because they look at this chart, they read the guide, and they say, oh my gosh, it's day 4 and I haven't seen the false rise yet. Have I killed my starter? What did I do wrong? And you start like beating yourself up. Every bag of flour is unique. It's kind of like a lottery ticket. You don't know what you're going to get in your bag of flour. And every starter is unique. I mean, every starter is literally a unique microbial population. So I'm showing this as if it's a 10-day cycle with certainty. What I'm trying to show here is that your starter will go through these phases that I'm showing in 10 days, but your timing might be longer or shorter. You might see the false rise on day 2, you might see it on day 5. But what you use this chart for is to say, where am I in the cycle generally, not specifically what should happen on day 3 versus day 4. So now we've successfully made it to day 4. You initially mixed it on day 1, you inspected it on day 2, stirred it up after 24 hours, inspected it on day 3, stirred it up after 48 hours if needed. Now we're 72 hours into the process, and this is when we do the first discard and feed. And as I said before, resist the temptation. People will tell you to discard and feed before day 4. Don't do it. Just stir it up and wait. That's when you're really building that initial yeast population, is in the first 72 hours. But now we're on day 4. Now we're ready to discard and refeed. The way you do this is you're going to need a scale. You're going to discard everything but 25 grams of starter that's in here, and you're going to feed it 50 grams of our flour blend, 50-50 mix of bread flour and whole wheat flour, and then feed that 50 grams of water. That's going to be our normal feeding ratio as we go forward. But before you discard, you want to inspect your starter. This is what it's going to look like. That big rise or the bloom will have subsided. This will smell really foul, and you should see some bubbles on the surface. So we've done our first discard on day 4, and this is when people always ask the question, what can I do with my discard? Can I save it? Can I make discard pancakes or discard waffles? Can I make a second starter out of my discard? The answer is no, no, and no. You don't want to save your discard until your starter is fully established. If you do everything perfectly right and you get lucky, that'll be around day 10, and I'll tell you the test of how you know when your starter is established. But until it's established, you have to assume that there's some bad bacteria in your sourdough starter and you want to discard it. Now, a lot of people are typically hearing this for the first time when I say there can be bad bacteria in a sourdough starter. It actually comes from the flour. If you read the U.S. Food and Drug Administration safety guidelines, they tell you do not eat raw flour because uncooked flour is a raw food and it can contain bacteria such as E. coli and Salmonella. So when you buy a bag of flour at the store, this flour is white, but this is not sterilized, this is not pasteurized. Basically anything that was in the wheat field can end up in this bag of flour. So when birds are flying over the wheat field, they don't have a bathroom up there. And when there's a cow pasture next to the wheat field and the flies are landing on the cow patties and then the flies come over and they land on the wheat, all that stuff can end up in a bag of flour. It's actually pretty gross. We don't typically worry about this when you're baking a cake or something because you mix it up and then you bake it 40 minutes later and baking will kill off that bacteria. But when you mix raw flour and water in a jar, you are reactivating and recultivating all the stuff that was attached to the flour in the field. We want to cultivate the yeast and lactic acid bacteria, and if you do this feeding and discarding process right, what that does is it flushes out all that bad bacteria, and the yeast and lactic acid bacteria work in a symbiotic relationship where the lactic acid bacteria each day starts to create vinegar. As your starter matures each day, the acidity is increasing. The pH, which is a measure of acidity, is dropping. And as you get that low pH environment or that high acidity environment, it's basically like adding vinegar to your jar of flour and water. And you know what vinegar does? It kills mold and it kills bacteria. If you went on a website and said, what's a natural way to kill bacteria and kill mold in my kitchen? People will tell you to use vinegar. That's what's in your starter, and that's what makes your starter safe by the time you get to day 10. It has its own internal defense mechanism. It's the morning of day 5. This is where reality sets in. Everybody's all excited after that big false rise on day 3, then you do your first discarding on day 4, and then you get to day 5 and you open your starter. It smells awful and there are a few bubbles on top and you say, oh, this isn't going to work. Be patient. It's totally normal. Day 4, 5, 6, 7, this is called the quiet period for a reason. Your starter has flushed out the bad bacteria largely, and now it's starting the long, slow climb to create the yeast population. This takes time. You just have to be patient. So you look at your starter on day 5, you're going to see a few bubbles on top. That's what you should expect. So on day 5, we're going to discard and refeed. Discard everything but 25 grams. Feed 50 grams of your flour blend, 50 grams of water, and put it aside and don't worry about it. It's going to be slow here. You can't do anything to make it go faster. You can't force feed it. You can't do anything. Just let it sit. It just needs time. Now day 6 comes along, and this will really test your patience. Open up your starter on day 6, take a look. What do we see? I see more bubbles. I see a few more bubbles than day 5. This is exciting and this is good. People look at it and say, seriously? Like 8 bubbles on my starter is good. Yesterday I had 3 bubbles. Today I have 8. That's a vast improvement. You should be really, really happy as long as you're seeing increasing bubble activity from day to day. So if you see more bubbles today than you saw yesterday when you fed it, throw yourself a parade, go have a drink. The process is working. We do our normal discard and refeed on day 6. Let it sit, ignore it, come back in 24 hours. So typically around day 7, we will begin the 3rd stage of the starter development cycle, and this is the slow strengthening stage. Your starter should begin to behave differently and look differently on or around day 7. Day 7, we're back. It's the morning of day 7. We open our jar. Boom. Look at that. Now I'm seeing a lot more bubble activity than I saw on day 6. And I'm starting to see a little bit of a rise in the starter. That's what you want to see around day 7. This is where your starter is really turning the corner and it's starting to strengthen. That massive increase in the bubble activity on the surface and the starter beginning to rise are the 2 things that you're looking for. The other interesting thing that will turn when you start to see that rise is the starter will start to smell differently. You won't smell the old cheese, the dirty socks, or the vomit. You'll actually start to smell a little bit of sweetness to it and a little bit of a vinegar smell. Those are the 2 signs of success that you want to look for in your starter. Vinegar and a sweet smell. So now on day 7, we do our normal discard and refeed, and we wait 24 hours. Now, if you get to day 7, and again, I'm using these days somewhat arbitrarily, let's just say around day 7, if you've had 3 days of very, very slow activity, this is where you need to intervene in the process. So here's what you want to look for. On the morning of day 7, if you're seeing the same or fewer bubbles than you saw on day 6, you don't want to discard and refeed. Now let me explain this, and this is all in the guide. I explain exactly how to do this. This method is a little different than some others because it's not just based on a strict 24-hour feeding schedule. You should be looking at your starter every day before you feed it, and you want to see increasing bubble activity from the previous day when you fed it. So what happens, this could happen on day 6, day 7, day 8, what if you see less bubble activity than you saw the previous day? It's totally possible, and it's not that uncommon. Here's what you need to do is you need to wait. So we use a 24-hour feeding schedule. That's a completely arbitrary schedule. The yeast doesn't know what time it is. The lactic acid bacteria doesn't know what time it is. And just by deciding at 24 hours that it's time to feed and discard, sometimes that gets out of sync with your starter's eating cycle. So we want to synchronize the feeding cycle with the eating cycle. The eating cycle shows you where it is in the process based on the bubbles. Sourdough starters, and yeast in particular, do not eat in secret. When yeast is reproducing and eating, it creates carbon dioxide. When it creates carbon dioxide, it creates bubbles. You'll see bubbles on the side, you'll see bubbles on the top. If you don't see bubbles on the side or on the top, your starter still has a full plate of food from the last feeding. So you don't want to discard and refeed. That will actually weaken it. You just want to give it more time. So let's say, here's the example. On day 6, I had a few bubbles on top when I discarded and fed, and that was more than I had on day 5. But on day 7, I see fewer bubbles than I saw on day 6. What do? Wait 6 hours, stir it up. Wait 12 hours, stir it up. Wait 18 hours, stir it up. You might have to wait 24 hours, stir it up. And wait until you see more bubble activity, because if you don't see more bubble activity than the previous day, there's still plenty of food in there. It's impossible for your starter to starve in secret. It will have shown you massive bubble activity before it's starving. So that watch and wait technique is critically important during this quiet period. Days 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you basically just have to watch for that bubble activity and use your judgment and wait until you see more bubble activity than the previous day before you discard and refeed. But there is one exception to this rule because this is a biological process and you can't predict or control everything. And the main thing you can't predict is what's in your bag of flour. So when you start with your bag of whole wheat flour, this is where the yeast and lactic acid bacteria comes from. Some bags of flour have a very high percentage of lactic acid bacteria and a very low percentage of yeast. And if you start to mix up your starter with that population imbalance, your starter will become very acidic. The acidity is good. We want that because that's what repels mold and it kills off foreign pathogens. But when your starter gets very acidic, it also chokes off the yeast. The yeast can't function when it's totally swimming in vinegar. So here's what you want to look for. If your starter has fewer bubbles than it did the previous day, as I said, at the 24-hour mark, you give it more time. And then you see no bubbles at the 30-hour mark, the 36-hour mark, or the 48-hour mark. So literally no increase in bubble activity for that second 24 hours. That generally means your starter is acidic and the yeast can't breathe. So at the 48-hour mark, no matter what you see, you want to discard and refeed. That's just a quick fallback rule that says 48 hours with no activity usually means something is wrong with your starter. Do your normal discard and refeed, see what happens the next day. So now, assuming that you didn't run into any of those issues where the starter stalled out, once your starter starts rising, now you want to watch for your starter to rise more each day before discarding and refeeding. So instead of watching just the surface bubble activity, now you have a real easy way to see, is my starter strengthening? So what do we see on day 8 versus day 7? I mean, look at this. Day 8, you can clearly see we have a taller rise than we have on day 7. So at our 24-hour mark, we discard and refeed. And you want to smell your starter. Sweet. A little vinegary. And now you're going to start to smell yeast. Smells a little bit like beer, a little bit like wine. That's lovely. That means your starter is really strengthening. So then you might ask the question, but Tom, on the morning of day 8, when I get ready to discard and feed, what if my starter hasn't risen as much as it rose on day 7? That's a great question. And what do you think my answer will be? Give it more time. Wait till it rises more. That's only partially correct. When you start to look at the rise in your starter in these last couple days, the starter may rise more or less each day. And the reason for that is because as the yeast is strengthening and it's rising your starter more, the lactic acid bacteria is also strengthening, which creates acid. And the acid actually will stop the starter from rising a little bit more quickly. Your starter is still incredibly strong, and we want that acidity to grow because that's what repels mold, and it keeps foreign pathogens from establishing themselves in your starter. But it can actually impede the rise a little bit. So in these last few days of your starter, you want to look for it to at least double. And the way that you look at it for doubling, that's why I have this rubber band on here. You want to see whatever this distance is below the rubber band to equal the distance above the rubber band. That's a doubling in your starter. That's a very general rule. And as long as your starter is doubling before you feed it the next morning, that's a good sign. You don't have to worry about the exact height of the rise. And let's even talk about doubling. Some starters will double, some starters will triple, some starters won't double. It's really a unique combination of the type of flour that you're using and that microbial mix. So rather than getting really hung up on the exact height of the rise, what you're looking for as your starter begins to near the end of this process is you want to look at the time to peak. How fast is your starter peaking? And I use that word peaking instead of doubling because peaking might be doubling, it might be tripling, it might be a 50% rise. So now you want to focus on the time to peak. The reason you want to focus on that time to peak is because that's the true measure of your starter strength, is how quickly it rises, not necessarily how tall it rises. So let me give you an example. A starter that doubles in height in 4 hours is stronger than a starter that triples in height in 8 hours, because the time to peak is more important than the height of the peak. You want a fast rising starter. So as you get into these final days, days 8, day 9, day 10, you want to look at the height of your rise, and generally speaking, you want to see it double before feeding, but don't get hung up on that if it doesn't exactly double. But also start to pay attention to the speed of the rise. So now on day 9, I look at my starter, and when I get ready to feed it, I look at it, and it rose about the same height as it did on day 8, but it rose faster. On day 8, my starter peaked in 10 hours. On day 9, my starter peaked in 8 hours, and my starter more than doubled. So I know with certainty my starter is strengthening, so I discard and refeed. And now on the morning of day 10, I look at my starter, and it actually rose a little bit less than on day 9, but it peaked, and it peaked faster than on day 9. It peaked in 4 hours. And now you might ask this question, if it's strengthening, why is the peak lower? Because I'm not only strengthening the yeast, I'm also strengthening the lactic acid bacteria. And the more acidic your starter becomes, it just sits a little bit flatter. It's no weaker, it's just lower. Because the strength of your starter is based on the time to peak, not the absolute percent rise in the starter. So then you're on day 10, your starter is peaking, and you want to start baking sourdough bread. When do you know it's ready to start baking? There is a simple ready-to-bake test. Now I'm going to give you a few versions of this. The standard test that you'll see in other videos and some of my other videos is this. If your starter peaks after a 1-1-1 feeding in 4 to 6 hours at a temperature of 74 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius, your starter is ready to bake. In this example, we're using a 1-2-2 feeding, not a 1-1-1 feeding, so you have a little bit wider window. The 1-2-2 test is your starter should roughly double in volume in 4 to 7 hours after a 1-2-2 feeding at 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 degrees Celsius. It just takes a little longer with a 1-2-2 versus a 1-1-1 sometimes. And then if you're conservative and you really want to be sure that your starter is ready, I add a secondary caveat here, which is you want to see your starter do that 3 days in a row. Just in the rare occurrence that you get some weird rise in your starter on day 7, for example, I wouldn't necessarily rely on that. So when you see your starter consistently rising or peaking within that 4 to 6 or 4 to 7 hour window, that's when you know with certainty your starter is ready to bake. And then some people will say, Tom, my starter's peaking after I feed it very consistently, but it takes 8 hours. Does that mean it's not ready to bake? The question I would ask is, what's your temperature of your kitchen or the temperature of your starter? Because your starter is incredibly temperature sensitive. The speed of the rise is directly related to the temperature of the starter. So for example, if your starter is taking 8 hours to rise and I ask you what your temperature is and you say 59 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius, the general rule of thumb is that for every 15 degree change in temperature in Fahrenheit or 8 degree change in temperature in Celsius, the time to peak will double. So yours would make perfect sense that if a strong starter is doubling in 4 hours at 73 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius, that exact same starter would double in 8 hours at 59 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. It's just math. So the temperature can impact your rise time. So when you apply that starter test, use that rule and adjust your target rise time based on the temperature of your starter. Here are the adjustments that I would apply as you go down from 74 degrees Fahrenheit to 59 degrees Fahrenheit for the expected rise times. So now, congratulations, you've done it. You've created a sourdough starter, you're ready to bake. A few things to remember. When your starter passes that ready to bake test, that is the minimal acceptable strength of your starter to begin baking. Your starter is still going to be fairly weak relative to other people's starters for a while. It takes about 30 days for your starter to really reach what I consider to be full strength. And then the flavor of your starter will really develop for the next year. So when people say they have a year-old starter, a 10-year-old starter, or a 20-year-old starter, it's not only the strength, the rising strength, it's really the flavor that develops, and that really comes with time. So in this 10-day period to get to a starter that you can use for baking, your starter is still really in its infancy. It will take, I'd say, 30 days of daily feeding to get it up to what I'd call adolescence, and then it takes maybe a year to develop full adult maturity, which includes that really complex, interesting, sour flavor of your starter. If your starter has stalled out and it's just not working, I have some other troubleshooting tips in this guide, the Ultimate Sourdough Starter Guide, and there's something in here called the stall point test, which you want to consider if you get to that day 8 or day 9 period, and no matter what you do, you just can't get your starter to do anything. Check out the stall point test in here and give that a try. That will normally help you break through the stall point of a starter. But then there are also cases where you just need to pull the plug, literally. I mean, if you're working at this for, say, 14 days, 16 days, 18 days, and your starter is still flat, there's a few bubbles on top, you want to go back and make sure that you didn't do anything that deviated from my recommendations. The number one deviation is, I say use 50% whole wheat flour, and after 15 days of struggling and your starter's not working, people say, Tom, I followed your starter exactly, your recipe, but I didn't use whole wheat flour. I used all-purpose flour, or I used 100% bread flour. This doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work. The yeast and lactic acid bacteria is in this bag. It's not in this bag. So the biggest problem I find when this method doesn't work is when people do flour substitution. But the other reality of this, as I mentioned before, every bag of flour is like buying a lottery ticket. You don't know what's in here. Some flours have more yeast and lactic acid bacteria cells in them than others. There's no amount of technique, there's nothing that you can do to change that. If you just drew a bad bag of flour, your starter is not going to work. Go to the store, buy another bag of flour, try it with a different brand or something like that, and it'll generally work. If you try it with a second bag of flour, it'd be unlikely to draw 2 bad bags of flour in my experience. And this flour is still perfectly good for baking bread, just not for creating a sourdough starter. And lastly, if you've tried 1, 2, 3 times, you've followed every step, you've done the troubleshooting guides, and it's just not working, there's no shame in buying or borrowing or asking somebody to give you a sourdough starter. In fact, if I were doing things over again, I probably would have purchased a starter. You can buy a fresh starter from King Arthur Bread Company on their website, and then start baking sourdough bread, see if you like it, see if you're interested in it. And then if you're really interested in it, then start creating a starter on the side, and you'll be a lot more patient letting your starter take 10 days, 14 days, however long it takes to get established, because you're not relying on it to start baking, you're still baking with your other starter. And then you have your own starter that you've created on your own, and people have some pride of ownership in that. But I can say, I've created many starters over the years. I bought starters, I borrowed starters. Some starters are just better than others. I mean, just because you created it yourself doesn't mean it's great. It's just your own, and people get kind of emotionally attached to it. But just go buy another starter, borrow one, ask a friend to use their starter for a while. Sometimes you'll find something that's better. Good luck with your new sourdough starter, and good luck on your sourdough journey.